The oral cavity is located in the mouth and includes the lips, the inside of the lips, the cheeks, the teeth, the gums, the front two-thirds of the tongue, the floor of the mouth, below the tongue, and the hard palate. Food enters through the labia, is broken down mechanically by the teeth, chemically broken down by saliva, then is pushed by the tongue into a ball-like mass called a bolus, and swallowed by the tongue, which provides test stimuli to your brain. Since its temperature and the texture manipulates food while chewing, the tongue and the uvula aid in swallowing, direct food towards the pharynx, stop food from coming out of your nose, and act as a boundary between the oral cavity and the pharynx. The reason you don't swallow your tongue in the process is because underneath your tongue there is a membrane called the lingual frenulum, which also helps with speaking. Salivary glands are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. A large parotid salivary gland is found slightly inferior and anterior to each ear. They swell up when you get the mumps, and ducts from these glands empty into the upper portion of the oral cavity. Smallest of the salivary glands is the sublingual salivary gland that's located under the tongue, and there's also the submandibular salivary gland that are located on both sides along the inner surfaces of the mandible. These glands collectively produce a small amount of saliva continuously to keep your mouth moist. Saliva contains antibodies, buffers ion waste products, and enzymes. Ptyalin is one of these digestive enzymes that speeds up chemical activity and breaks down carbohydrates, which is broken down in glucose so it can be more easily absorbed in the digestive tract. The pharynx is a common passageway for food, water, and air. This extends from the base of the skull to the level of the 6 cervical vertebrae. Consists of 3 parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. During swallowing, passageways to the nasal and respiratory regions are protected from the accidental introduction of food liquids. Nasopharynx is blocked by the soft palate or flap of tissue called the epiglottis, which covers the airways to the lungs as the trachea rises during swallowing, forcing the bolus into the esophagus. Esophagus is responsible for transporting food from the pharynx to the stomach. It extends from the pharynx through the thoracic cavity and diaphragm to the stomach. The esophagus is normally a collapsed tube until a bolus is swallowed. The bolus moves to the esophagus through a muscular ring begin structure known as a pharyngeoesophageal sphincter. This is like opening the door to the office food center. We can't rely on gravity to move food through the esophagus, so the muscles of the esophagus begin rhythmic contractions to work food down the stomach. This is called peristalsis. When the bolus reaches the end of the esophagus, the second door must be opened to allow entry into the stomach. This lower esophageal sphincter, also known as the cardiac sphincter, which relaxes wet food into the stomach, then closes it to prevent its gastric juice from squirting up into the esophagus. Heartburn, or pyrosis, is what happens if the door inadvertently opens. Esophagus also helps with bolus by excreting mucus so its walls are slippery. The esophageal walls are lined with stratified squamous epithelium, which makes the esophagus resistant to abrasion, temperature extremes, and irritation by chemicals. 3 abnormalities of the esophageal sphincter is GERD, heartburn, and eosinophilia esophagitis, which are located in the esophagus and involve refluxes of gastric juices. The alimentary canal is the esophageal onward. It includes the esophagus, the stomach, and intestines. The innermost layer that lines the lumen of the canal is the mucosa. This layer is composed mostly of surface epithelium with some connective tissue. Anything smooth muscle layer surrounding mucosa also processes cells that secrete digestive enzymes to break down foodstuffs, goblet cells that secrete mucus for lubrication. The submucosa is the next layer and is composed of soft connective tissue. This layer contains blood and lymph vessels. The fatty tissue similar to your tonsils, called pyre patches and nerve endings. The next layer is the muscularis externa, composed of 2 layers of smooth muscle. The innermost layer encircles the canal, where the outer layer is longitudinal in nature, so it lies in the direction of the canal. The outermost layer is the serosa, which is made of a single flat serous fluid producing cells supported by connective tissue. For most of the canal serosa is the visceral peritoneum. The peritoneum is a serous membrane in the abdominopelvic cavity. The serous membrane has 2 layers. The road peritoneum covers the organs, and the peritoneum lines the wall of the abdominopelvic cavity. Between the layers is a fluid-filled potential space called the peritoneal cavity. This fluid is important for keeping the outer surface of the intestines moist, allowing friction-free movement in the digestive organs against the abdominal pelvic cavity. Second, the peritoneum has several extensions called mesentery that drape over the abdominal organs. The esophagus differs from the rest of the alimentary canal in that it possesses only a loose layer of connective tissue called the adventitia that restrains the vessel from excessive extension and recoil. The stomach is located on the left side of your abdominal pelvic cavity under the diaphragm, covered almost completely by the liver. Although the stomach can hold up to 4 liters when totally filled, it can expand or decrease diameter next to the deep folds called rugae in the stomach, which allow for size changes. The functions of the stomach include acting as a temporary holding area for ingested food. It secretes gastric acid and enzymes, which mixes with the food, causing chemical digestion, regulates the rate at which the now partially digested food, a thick, heavy cream called chyme, enters the small intestine, and it absorbs small amounts of water and substances on a very limited basis. The stomach is divided into 4 regions. The cardiac region of the stomach, which is closest to the heart around the lower esophageal sphincter. The fundus, a dome-shaped region, which is actually a lateral and slightly superior to the cardiac region, temporarily holds food as it first enters the stomach. The body is a mid-portion in the largest region of the stomach. The funnel-shaped terminal end of the stomach is called the pylorus. Most of the digestive work of the stomach is performed in the pyloric region, and another door, the pyloric sphincter, to travel to the small intestine. Gastric juice is a general term for a combination of hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, and mucus cells. Pepsinogen is secreted by the chief cells, and the hydrochloric acid is secreted by. All cells, these 2 cell types, have a special relationship, and one that pepsinogen makes contact with hydrochloric acid and chief digestive enzyme pepsin is formed. Pepsin is needed to break down proteins. Even though it doesn't actually digest food by itself, hydrochloric acid does break down connective tissue and meat. Healthy stomach is protected by mucus cells, which generally a thick layer of mucus to shield the stomach lining from the effects of hydrochloric acid. All cells are secreted protein that is known as intrinsic factor, which is needed for absorption of vitamin B12, which is needed for the formation and growth of red blood cells. Some people, this is important, protein not produced in sufficient amounts, or they might have a condition that destroys intrinsic factor, which can mean vitamin B12 deficiency, called pernicious anemia. Stomach activity is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, particularly the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is stimulated, stomach's motility increases, as does the secretory rates of gastric glands. The 3 phases of gastric juice production are the cephalic phase, which occurs as a result of sensory stimulation such as sight, smell, or food. This input stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system from the medulla oblongata, and the release of the hormone gastrin is increased. When gastrin travels through the blood and reaches the stomach, gastrin glands activity is increased. This leads us to gastric phase, which is over 2/3 the gastric juices are secreted as food moves into the stomach. As food moves into the stomach, it begins to stand stomach distance and signals back to the brain, which fires a reply that gastric glands to step up their work. As chyme is formed, it is passed through the pyloric sphincter to the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. This begins intestinal phase of gastric juice regulation. As the duodenum senses the acidity of chyme, intestinal hormones are released, causing gastric glands in the stomach to decrease gastric juice production. The brain is also signaled and sends a message to inhibit gastric juice secretion because it no longer is needed now that the food bolus, now called chyme, has left the stomach. When the chyme begins its movement through the duodenum and onto the rest of the small intestine, those inhibitory responses are halted so gastric juice production can continue once again with a new bolus of food enters the stomach. There are 3 regions in the small intestine. The duodenum is approximately 25 centimeters long. It is located near the head of the pancreas. The jejunum is the midsection and approximately 2.5 meters. The terminal of the intestine is the ileum section that attaches to the large intestine, the ileocecal valve. The structure of the wall in the small intestine possesses circular folds called pilici, or circulares, and finger-like protrusions in the lumen called villi. Villi also have outer layers of columnar epithelium cells, which possess microscopic extensions known as microvilli. And the purpose of the microvilli in the circular folds is to provide an incredible increase in the surface area of the small intestine. This increases efficiency of the absorption of nutrients. Each villus contains a network of capillaries The lymphatic capillaries are called luteal. Intestinal glands are located between villi. Capillaries absorb and transport sugars, the amino acids, to the liver for further processing before sent throughout the body. Glycerol and fatty acids are absorbed by the villi and converted into a lipoprotein, travels on lacteal, where it is now a milky white substance called chyle. Chyle goes directly into the lymphatic vessels that then deposit the bloodstream via the left subclavian vein for distribution throughout the body. Beginning at the junction with the end of the small intestine extending into the anus, the large intestine almost totally borders the small intestine. Large intestine is responsible for water reabsorption, absorption of vitamins produced by normal bacteria in the large intestine, packaging and compacting waste products for the elimination from the body. Large intestine is divided into three main regions: cecum, colon, and rectum. Large intestine is large in diameter but not in length, hat-shaped structure. Cecum receives any undigested food such as cellulose and water from the ileum of the small intestine. The infamous appendix is attached to the cecum. The appendix is a slender, hollow, dead tube lined with lymphatic tissue. The colon can further be divided into four sections: ascending, transverse, and descending in sigmoid. The ascending travels at the right side of the body to the level of the liver. The transverse colon travels across the abdomen just below the liver and the stomach. Bending downward near the spleen, the descending colon goes down the left side, where it becomes the sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon extends to the rectum. Rectum opens to the anal canal, which leads to the anus, which relaxes as it opens to allow the passage of solid waste or feces.